When I was in college, I had a couple really formative experiences that taught me a lot about becoming more available for people. One, after my freshman year, I took a job for the summer being a high school camp counselor at a Christian youth camp in Maryland. And so for 9 weeks straight, I spent my life among about 40 or 50 guys, and then we also during the day did a lot of activities with girls, but 24/7 around high school guys. They needed something at 2 o'clock in the morning. I was the first point of contact, and some of them did. Some of them liked to push the boundaries at night, and during the day, we were there. We were there for them all the time, and I had to be available. My sophomore year of college, the way that my college, it was a Christian university, and the way that they structured their outreach into different students' lives is they had different positions on the dorm floor who were responsible for kind of looking after people spiritually, kind of like shepherding people or pastoring people on, a very basic level on each dorm. And so that was kind of my role and responsibility. And so I would just wander the halls a lot of times after classes or on weekends during free time and look for open doors and have conversations with different guys. And then we would spend time with different students out in the cafeteria and out at different events and activities. And when you're a college student and you're not working a full-time job, you're doing classes, you're doing homework, but there's a lot of time for flexibility and a lot of time to make yourself available for people. And I learned that had a lot of benefits as well. Those relationships were fostered, and we saw a lot of spiritual growth in people's lives because we were able to be constantly available. And then, you leave your younger years or your college days, and you get more commitments in life, or you have kids, or you have grandkids, and you have full-time work, and all these things monopolize more and more of our time. And so maybe it's more difficult to make ourselves available, but I think through today's message, we're going to see with Jesus, he is aiming for availability in his life. And he makes several very intentional steps to be that way. And I think it's really challenging for us, if we want to represent Jesus in our world, in our walk of life, wherever God takes us, we really need to focus on making ourselves available for people. Because if we're not accessible, really what kind of an impact can we make? So we're going to look at different aspects of that today. And the first way that Jesus made himself available, he did it intentionally. We're going to look at his intentionality. And he makes very practical decisions that make himself more available to people in general. So we want to start out by looking at a few of those choices he makes. Starting in verse 12, it says this in Matthew 4, when Jesus, heard that John the Baptizer, had been arrested, he withdrew into Galilee. He left Nazareth behind. And we'll look at a map in a few moments and see where those locations are, just refresh our memory again. But essentially, Jesus had been operating down with John the Baptist in the southern part of what's now Israel and Judea, close to the Jordan River and the Dead Sea, spending time with his followers, getting to know people, doing some baptizing along with John the Baptist. But that started to draw some attention from the religious leaders in Jerusalem. Not necessarily positive attention, because they saw John the Baptist and they saw Jesus as some religious competition that was kind of brewing in the area. And then there was a point where King Herod Antipas of the northern territories, had John the Baptist arrested because of something he tried to convict the king over, a relationship choice that was not pleasing to God. And so the king's response was just to throw John the Baptist in jail. And also it mentions Jesus navigating away from Nazareth. Nazareth was Jesus' hometown for many years. But we know from an instance in one of the other Gospels that when Jesus was speaking in a synagogue in Nazareth, his hometown people rejected him. They didn't believe he was this promised Messiah king that was predicted in the Old Testament. They knew him as Jesus, the son of Mary and Joseph, who grew up down the street. So they really didn't believe anything he had to say. So Jesus distanced himself from those two areas. He left those areas behind. I put on your notes, he relocated to avoid the barrier of opposition. And sometimes there are things in our life, just maybe different circumstances that we're in or places that we operate that actually hold us back spiritually. And so maybe we have to distance ourselves from certain things so that we have a little more freedom or openness with people. Because the place we're at currently, there's not a lot of openness spiritually. Or maybe the people we're investing in currently, there's not really a lot happening spiritually. And so we have to move to a place where people are more open to hear this message of Christ. And maybe that's something that we discover over time. But Jesus did that. It says, and he went to live in Capernaum by the sea in the region of Zebulun and Naphtali. So he establishes this new home base. It's no longer Jesus of Nazareth. Now it's Jesus of Capernaum, a new home base in a different area. And I think one of the reasons behind that is to put him kind of in the heart of where his ministry is going to be focused. I remember when Christine and I took this position, I took the position as a pastor here at Mountain View a little over 6 years ago. We lived about 20 miles away. And that was okay. I mean, it was a 25-minute commute over here to the church, and we could still operate things and be involved and get the work done. But we really had a heart to become a part of this community. Because when you move into a smaller town like Laverne, about 4,500 residents, it just opens up a whole new level of being a part of the community and people knowing who you are. Instead of those people that came in to take the job at this church and still live 20 miles away, it's now we know what neighborhood you're in. And we have conversations with people and they would say, oh, yeah, I know somebody who lives in the same cul-de-sac or the same subdivision that you do. Or they'd say, I live in your neighborhood. And we got more involved with the city and different events the city was holding. And they knew us not as those people who are still kind of distant, but as the people who came to this community to become a part of things and to pour into this community. And I think that was one of the reasons why Jesus moved to Capernaum as well. It put him right on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, and a lot of his ministry focused on the villages and the towns that surrounded that sea and the surrounding areas. I want to show you a picture I think I have on here next. This is the town of Capernaum. There's a lot of ruins there, and so if you go there today, you can see a lot of the archaeology. Some of it is the time of Christ. Some of it is the next 500 years following the time of Christ. But you can still maybe get an idea and a picture if you go online or if you visit there someday, or maybe you have, of what this village was like where Jesus was based. They have places designated where they think even was Peter's home where he operated from, and perhaps where Jesus operated from as well in that area. But he put himself in the heart of the people he was working among. He wanted to become, again, accessible, and so he took on this new home base. It says in verse 14 and 15, was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. The land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, along the sea road, beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles, because there were Gentile nations that were right on the borders of Galilee. The people who lived in darkness have seen a great light. And for those living in the shadowland of death, light has dawned. And so back when Moses God divided up really the land of Israel and allotted it to the people through Joshua and their campaigns into Israel and that land with the Canaanites, and eventually Israel possessing that promised land. Different sections of the land were apportioned for different tribes, different relatives, you might say, within Israel. And so Zebulun and Naphtali, they got this region around the Sea of Galilee to the north. And you might think, well, that seems like a nice area. Lots of water, lots of fishing, maybe some agriculture. But one of the downsides was, it says here it was on that road, right? The way by the sea, or the sea road. Because if you go, again, out to the east, I'll put it in your perspective, out to the east of Israel, you have a huge desert, the Arabian desert, right? And so you have a huge area that's pretty desolate. And so when armies and military campaigns would move through the area, maybe come from the area that was Babylon and Persia and those empires to the east, and they would move in to try to attack places like Jerusalem and Israel, or maybe go down toward Egypt. The first point of contact, they wouldn't move through a desert. They would go around through the areas that were more well-watered, right, where you'd have access to water and food and supplies. They would always come crashing down through Zebulun and Naphtali. And so time after time after time, for hundreds of years, these two tribes would just get wrecked by armies moving through the area. Just about the time you recovered from one little campaign, a few years later, somebody else would start another campaign. And so you kept getting hit over and over and over again and decimated and devastated. And Jesus became a beacon of hope. He's this light that dawned to a land that had been repeatedly oppressed by enemy armies for several hundred years. And Isaiah predicted this would happen. You've gotten beat up a lot, Naphtali and Zebulun, but God's going to send a beacon of hope to you. God's going to bring about justice finally. And it was in the form of Jesus. And Jesus, you think about all of his miracles and his healing, and that was sort of to bring about the balance of God's justice to an area that had been victimized by injustice for many, many years. And that's actually why Jesus was placed in that region, was to balance out that inequality. But he became available to those people and centered right in the midst of those people. I want to move on to verse 17 and move from his kind of intentional decisions that he's making to Jesus' invitation. he also invited people into relationships with each other and with himself in order to make himself more accessible on a personal level. He wanted to change people's personal relationships and also different individuals' relationships with him. I have another image here just to give you an idea. You can look at that really quickly. So this is the Sea of Galilee, just one view of that to kind of set the scene in your mind. It's always nice for me to picture where things are happening and what things look like. Obviously, this is present day. But the geography and the sea itself probably wouldn't have changed much, just the towns and places that are developed. And you can still see a herd of sheep grazing out on the hillside there, even in this current photo. And so maybe those types of things, would have been pretty common back 2,000 years ago as well. But it says, from that point on, when Jesus moved his home base to Capernaum, Jesus began to preach, "Repent, because the kingdom of heaven has come near." Those lines should seem familiar to you. We talked about those a couple weeks ago. Who said those exact lines? Do you remember? I hear it whispered. John the Baptist, John the Baptizer, right? He had the exact same line, "Repent, because the kingdom of heaven has come near." And so Jesus took up this same message. It was really passed along kind of like a baton. John started it, and Jesus carried it on. And he challenged the crowds, just as John had, to think and live differently. That's what the word repent means. It literally means think differently. Because God's kingdom, it's now become permanently available for anybody to enter, to have access to. Again, that term has come near. It's in a certain tense in the Greek language this was penned in that has a permanence to it. It's from this point on and enduring. It doesn't end. And so permanently God's kingdom is available. And because it's permanently available, it's available even today for us to step into. But we got to think differently, again, if we want to be people who are really like living in light of that and representing that kingdom well. So he echoed John the Baptizer's message. And that change of mindset, if people adopted it, it was really going to change the game in terms of how people would interact with each other. Jesus had taken up the message of John. And back when John was elaborating on this message, Jesus will do it in chapter 5. That's really what the Sermon on the Mount is. It's Jesus elaborating more on what it means to think differently. But John had gone into a little bit of detail. And in John's detail, he said a few things. He told people to start pursuing relationships with their kids. That's one thing that you can do to think differently. He tells people to share what they don't need with people who do. So instead of focusing on yourself, start focusing on what other people lack. I know we can kind of hear the TV out in the back a little bit, so if you maybe want to step out for a second, Jeremiah, and maybe have them turn it down just a little bit. I don't want that to bother you. If I can hear it, I'm sure you can if you're in the back, and so you're going to hear a 2-second echo because that's our internet right now, and it's on the live feed from the internet currently, so just explaining that real quick. But John was telling people, don't profit at other people's expense. Again, don't be selfish. Don't abuse your power. Be at peace with the things you have. Be content. Believe that Jesus is the eternal one who came to pay for the sins of the world. Those were the types of things John the Baptizer had been challenging people with to get them to think differently. And Jesus, again, would carry that on, but take it to the next level with the Sermon on the Mount, which we'll come into next week in chapter 5 of Matthew. So these concepts, they were going to, if people would actually live this way, it was going to greatly enhance the way people got along with each other. It was going to improve their relationships. So Jesus wanted to improve the relationships that people had with each other and draw them closer, make people more available for each other. But he also wanted to make himself more available for people, specifically a close-knit group of followers or disciples. It says in verse 18, as Jesus was walking along the Sea of Galilee, he saw 2 brothers, Simon, who was called Peter, and his brother Andrew. They were casting a net into the sea since they were fishermen. And if you read Matthew, you kind of get the idea that this is the very first time that that Jesus has ever run into Peter and Andrew. These guys are just out, casting their net in the water, and this strange guy named Jesus walks up and says, "Come, follow me, and I'll make you fishers of men." I mean, would you do that if somebody just approached you like that? I don't think I would, quite honestly. But there's actually been a long history, and John's gospel covers some of this, and it fills in some of the gaps that's happened, because Andrew and Peter, and I believe John as well, actually ran into Jesus for the first time a couple of days after John baptized him, and so months and months before this point in time. And they had spent time with Jesus in his home when he was with John the Baptist. They had spent time at a wedding feast back up near Nazareth and Cana of Galilee. They had gone back down and celebrated Passover with Jesus, and had spent some random time when Jesus was baptizing along with John the Baptist out in the wilderness for a period of time. And so they hadn't followed him on a very consistent basis, but they had been interacting with Jesus for months at this point. So when Jesus walks up to them and says, "Come and follow me," there is a relationship that's been brewing for a while, but Jesus is about to call things to the next level. He's about to offer them a deeper level of availability. And if they accept it, it's going to change the course of their life. It's drastically going to alter their priorities, and it's even going to change their destiny. And so this is what he says in verse 19. "Follow me," he told them, "and I'll make you fishers for people." I'll make you fish for people. Immediately it says they left their nets and they followed him. And so Jesus made an offer, and it was for something deeper, and they realized that. He said, "Peter and Andrew, follow me so I can prepare you to fish for people." He's making a parallel between what they're doing for fish and what they can do working for him in his kingdom. And essentially Jesus is saying, if you come and you follow me on a more committed basis, I'll teach you, I'll set an example for you, I'll show you how to draw people into God's kingdom instead of just drawing fish into your net. And so they chose to put their commitment to Jesus ahead of their occupation as fishermen, despite the fact that there would be a cost. And there would be a cost. They're risking several things. Financial stability. Can you imagine if you're working a full-time job and you're supporting your family? We know Peter had a wife and a mother-in-law. We don't know about kids. But you have a family and you've got this job that's kind of sustaining things, making the ends meet and paying the bills. And all of a sudden you set that commitment on hold in order to devote a great amount of your time to learning. Maybe in present day, you go back to school and you work on getting an education. Or in this point in time, Peter and Andrew devote themselves to becoming students of Jesus and learning from him. That's going to make a financial impact. There's going to be less food on the table, perhaps, as a result of that. It's a step of faith that they went through. Also, it's a new occupation to learn. They're really familiar with fishing, but they don't really know about drawing people into God's kingdom. So they got to start again, and there's a learning curve, and they're already into their career. There's a lot of changes, and there's a cost. But they're willing to make it. Jesus is making himself available, and that's a higher priority to them than just having this consistent, reliable career that's going to meet the needs and pay the bills. Not only does Jesus offer this to Peter and Andrew at this point, but it says going on from this conversation with Peter and Andrew where they're following him, it says he saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John. And there's a prior history with Jesus and these individuals as well. They were in a boat with Zebedee, their dad, mending their nets, and he called them. And it says immediately they left the boat and their father and followed him. And the word followed, there's a little bit of a nuance that doesn't come through in the English translation, and so I want to just mention that at this moment. We think, well, how permanent is this kind of following situation here? Did they just start walking and take a hike with Jesus around the Sea of Galilee for a day? But it's a much more permanent thing. That term followed, it actually literally means to join roads with somebody. And so what they were doing, they had been in this family business, this family partnership with their dad, with Zebedee. And their path in life, their career path, you might say, had been learning the fishing trade from their father, having access to the nets, having access to dad's boat, and everything that they needed. And they were in this position to take over the family business and kind of being apprenticed into that. And with Jesus' offer in a moment, they left that behind. Jesus called them away from a family partnership. I had a friend whose dad ran a really successful business. It was an import foreign car dealership and also a parts business that was very, very productive from a business standpoint. And he had been hoping all along that his son would be able to take over the family business and keep running the auto dealerships and the parts business. When he got to the point where he would retire, he just handed over to his son. And his son decided instead that he wanted to become a pastor, and not even a pastor of a stable church. He wanted to get a Bible education and go to a very small town and start a church from scratch and work a full-time job not making much money per hour just to meet the needs of his family so that he could start this small church and people could have access to the Bible in a town where they really didn't have it. And his dad was probably initially hurt because he had such great plans, and now there's questions. What happens to the family business? What if my son, lives below the poverty line for years and years, and I could have provided for him so well, and now it's going to happen to everything. And so this is a big, huge change. And it's really the same change that James and John are stepping into. They choose to align with the path of Jesus instead of the path of their dad. And there's going to be a great cost. Maybe the family business will collapse. Maybe things are going to get harder for their dad who doesn't have their help. Maybe their dad's going to misunderstand them and they'll have a rocky relationship from here on out because he sees it as rejection. Maybe they'll lose out on part of their inheritance because a lot of it was the stuff in the fishing industry, and so maybe he'll find somebody else to hand that off to. And they risked all those things, but they gained access to this person who was both God and king in the flesh, who wanted to make himself more available to them so he could teach them by his example. And they wouldn't have the time to learn from his example if they were always out fishing. So they chose that commitment to live with and imitate the lifestyle and learn from the teachings of Jesus instead of the commitment to take on the family business. And at this point, maybe that's a good thing for us to just hold in front of ourselves as well and say, what is my life really most committed to? How available am I to entering into a relationship with Jesus? Because even though we can't physically follow after Jesus and he can't lead us by the hand and show us everything we need to do differently and how to relate with all these different types of people and how to help people to the best of our ability, in a sense we can have this relationship with Jesus through his word, through the Holy Spirit. Jesus is very much alive and well, and we are very much able to enter into a more committed relationship with him because he surely is available for us. The question is, how available are we to him? And I ask myself that too, because working at a church, you think, you have all this time to just sit back and pray and talk with Jesus and learn from him. But there's actually a ton of things that need to be done on a practical level around this facility and with programs and things that happen and with studying. And so sometimes even what I do will pull me apart from actually spending time with Jesus and being available to him. And so no matter where we're at, it's this ongoing struggle to make ourselves available. But Jesus is here for us. Lastly, I want to take a look at Jesus' itinerary. What does Jesus do to make himself available to people? Because I think there's a lot we can learn here as far as what we can do to also make ourselves available to the people who are around us. And his public service is really how I would summarize how Jesus increases his availability to the public. And we'll look at his itinerary. What was a day in the life of Jesus like in this next section? It says in verse 23, Jesus was going all over Galilee. And so these regions that we saw on the map previously and the pictures that we saw of the Sea of Galilee, Jesus is walking all over this region. He continually walked. That's the tense of this verb. He kept walking among the people of Galilee. That was his habit, his hobby. He liked hiking, I guess, a lot. And so he would just walk around the region based out of Capernaum through the different villages and mingle with people. Jewish historian, a guy named Josephus, he records that by AD 66, so a little bit after this time, there were over 200 villages in Galilee. Galilee was about the size, as far as that whole area, about the size of a quarter of Washington County, Utah. So you can imagine how that'd be a fair amount of territory to start walking around, right? Parts of it were sea, parts of it were wilderness, and so Jesus would have been more focused on the towns and villages probably and the roads than he would have been just, taking a trek out through the middle of the woods or the mountains. But that was the size kind of and scope of this place. And I think the biggest step to becoming more available is actually putting ourselves among people. I kind of mentioned that. That's a lesson that I learned when I was in college. But I also experienced this on a couple of small mission trips that I took a few years ago to Africa. I ended up in 2 small villages out away from major cities. And we were basically for hours a day walking these trails that connected huts and mud brick housing from place to place in a village. And as we're walking, we're encountering people. There are people in the fields working. There are people tending their animals. There are people who are sitting and shelling beans or things, preparing food in the yard. There are people who are just at home that don't have anything else that they're doing at the moment. Most people are living by the food that they grow in their garden, essentially, and that's how they're making life happen. They got a little bit of time to stop and talk. And we had a lot of time on our trip to stop and talk because we were just among people, and that was kind of the point of it all. Then I fast forward to now, and I get home from work, I scream into the driveway, I get out, I run inside, I try to help Christine with our kids or jump into helping prepare dinner or things like that, and we have all these routines and get the kids ready for bed and get up in the morning and start the whole thing over again, or maybe a different routine for different days, and life is crazy. And I look out my window and I see a retired neighbor lady standing on the front porch of my neighbors who I haven't spoken to in weeks, just chatting, talking to them about life. And I realize she's got something that I don't get. And that's, she's available. She's just out among people. And I think maybe sometimes I need to slow down and just take a walk as a family out through the neighborhood and see who we see. For some of you that are here seasonally, a walk around the RV park, which you probably do, maybe, and just talk with people, or wherever you find yourself, a walk around to be among people. I think that's really the biggest step, is just getting out and being among people. And from that point, everything else can springboard, and Jesus can do these other things and invest in people's lives. But it starts with just being among people. And we actually, in our culture, have to pause and almost intentionally get out and take a walk or put ourselves where we might have a conversation with someone. But Jesus was doing that, and everything else flourished from that point. And as he was walking around, he was looking for 3 different kinds of opportunities. The first thing it says in the next phrase, it says teaching in their synagogues. So obviously, you probably can't do that in your neighborhood today. Not too many synagogues out there that you can jump into. But I think there are ways we can look at this and maybe apply it in our situation as a church. But he was teaching in synagogues. Synagogues are places where Jews would assemble, but not just for worship. They would assemble on the Sabbath, their Saturday, for worship. They would also assemble on feast days for worship and prayer, mainly prayer and then reading of the Old Testament law and the Old Testament prophets, followed by a short sermon, somebody talking about some of the things that had been read and sharing their perspectives from it. They would meet on those days, but a synagogue was also a school, and it was also a place to have community dinners or meals, and it was also a place where strangers could find lodging for free. And it was also a place where important decisions would be made, almost like a court, settling disputes between people. And it was a place where people would bring charity that they wanted to be dispersed. And it was a place where people would come who were in need of something, and they would get their needs met. All these things happened in the synagogue. And there were people who had authority over different aspects, maintaining the facility or organizing the teaching. People would show up for a worship meeting, and nobody would know who was going to share or speak. Can you imagine showing up on Sunday morning and you come in and you don't know who's going to read the Bible, who's going to sing the songs, who's going to pray, and who's going to give the message? That was every week in a synagogue. And there was a person who was the chief ruler of the synagogue, and they were responsible for picking people out and saying, today, Sam, you're going to pray for us. And today, Elin, you're going to sing for us. And today, I don't know, let's see, Julie, you're going to read from the law, and Leroy, you're going to read from the prophets, and John, you're going to give the sermon today. Go. And that's how it happened. So a little bit different setup than what we're used to. But Jesus was going in, and because the format was a little more free flow, people would say, Jesus, why don't you read from this? Jesus, why don't you share today? And people knew his reputation, and so he probably got a few more invites to be the person that spoke than your average person. But he used his gift to build up his religious community in these different towns that he was among the people in. So they knew him. He was a familiar face, and they would invite him in to be a part of this. And maybe we should use the gift that we have to build up our religious community that we're among as well. Maybe that's a good application for this. He was also preaching the good news of the kingdom. Preaching just meant announcing. He was announcing this redeeming way of life that people could enter into. You can be forgiven by God. He was trying to eliminate affliction people were experiencing. He was loving people. He was focusing on the heart of the law, which is God's heart, instead of just the letter and all these different rules that the Pharisees and other religious leaders had developed. And I think that type of preaching where you're just inviting people to experience this redeeming way of life, this better way of life that includes God's forgiveness, but loving people, making life better for people, focusing on God's heart. I think a lot of people would actually want to buy into that and experience it and become a part of it. And maybe it's a public platform that you use, or maybe it's just a conversation with somebody in your neighborhood. But you say, hey, like this Christianity thing, this Jesus following thing, it's actually about a lot more than just like believing these specific things about God. It's about entering into this more refreshing, more redeeming way of life. Are you interested in hearing more? And he was doing that. And then the third aspect of what he was doing is he was walking around this region continually. He was alleviating physical suffering. And because Jesus had these miraculous powers from God as God in the flesh, he had a little bit more punch, packed in that ability to alleviate physical suffering. He was this person who was predicted again to go into the lands of Zebulun and Naphtali and even out the injustices that had been provoked on them for generations from all these armies and stuff, and bring them a little extra healing to boost things up. But he was focused on, at the base of it all, how can I cause people's suffering to decrease? I want to let you into one of our elders' meetings and conversation I think is cool. I never asked our elders if I could share this, and so I hope they don't care. But I'm going to take the license. I feel like I know where the line is. So one of our elders was presenting a few different missions opportunities that he felt like we should consider as a church. And another one of our elders was Gene. So if you want to talk with Gene afterwards, I'm going to tell a story about him. But there were several things on the table. One mission's focus was on training leadership internationally. One was on planting a church in a city. And one was on supplying water. And at many places and many meetings I've been a part of in the past, probably the church plant or the training of leadership would have risen to the top, and people would have said, let's put our support into that, or let's present that before our church congregation first. But Gene's reaction, I think, was more in line with Jesus' reaction here of trying to alleviate physical suffering. He basically said, like one of his quotes, one of his lines that I've picked up on is, that's a no-brainer. And so he goes, that's a no-brainer. The water. Well, why the water? What about a church? What about training people? Well, if somebody doesn't have access to clean drinking water, that's the most basic need of life. Your body lasts about 3 or 4 days without water. How can you get more basic than that? And unclean water causes all of these problems. That's probably the biggest barrier that people could face to spiritual interest and spiritual growth, if they don't have clean water. You know, what more basic need could you meet? How could you more basically eliminate suffering? And he saw that, and I think there's merit to that, which is why I tell the story, because that's encouraging. I think that's in the line of what Jesus would say. How are people going to see through to this kingdom I'm offering them if they don't even have clean water to drink? That's going to be a barrier. What if people don't have food on the table and I say, you know what? Like, God has all these great things for you. And you're like, yeah, but I don't have a meal tonight. Or, yeah, but I don't have any water to drink. Those are pretty basic needs. And God, in his heart, has a heart to eliminate evil and inequality and injustice and provide some of these most basic needs. And because Jesus was just focused on alleviating physical suffering, what happened? This is in the next phrase in verse 25. Large crowds followed him. He didn't have to advertise, because people just somehow get on board with people who are trying to eliminate their suffering. I don't know what it is about that, but people are suffering, somebody's helping, and they say, okay, I'll take that. And so word starts to spread by word of mouth, and people come, it says, from Galilee, Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and beyond the Jordan. This is not Galilee alone anymore. These are different areas, and these are areas with drastically different demographics. Galilee has a lot of devoted Jews, even more than Jerusalem had, people who are really committed to the Old Testament and the law. Many of the Pharisees are from there, and they're preaching there. The Decapolis is a group of 10 different city-states. They're independently governed. Roman citizens live there, so they're not Jews. They have pagan temples in those areas. And those people also are attracted to Jesus because he's eliminating suffering. He's doing miracles in different ways. It says here, he healed every disease and sickness. News about him spread. They brought to him all those who were afflicted, which means miserable, those suffering from various diseases and intense pains, the demon-possessed, the epileptics, which could also imply mental illness, the paralytics, people with nerve disorders, and he heals all of them. So this big variety of people are coming to Jesus and receiving relief, and people from all these demographics hear about it, and they're all interested. The urban population of Jerusalem comes up. The population of Judea, who kind of have this proud sense because they're the people that their descendants kind of stayed committed to only marrying other Israelites for generations and came back from captivity in Babylon. And then you have people from Perea across the Jordan, and they're cultivating this really arid, rugged land. So, they're gruff, and they can handle working in the desert and growing olives and working vineyards in tough soil and conditions. And all these people are coming to Jesus for him. They're all drawn in different ways. And everybody, for some reason, feels comfortable approaching Jesus, which I think is really remarkable. And I'm thinking about parallels for us as a church as we close this morning. How do we make it to where people, they want to hear this message of Jesus from us? First of all, we have to become available ourselves. And really, we have to be out among people. If we don't have availability, we don't really have anything, right? We have to be out among people. But it's even more than that. We have to take opportunities to use our gifts in our own religious communities, but also we have to share about this redeeming way of life that Jesus offers. And we really have to focus on alleviating suffering because that's one of the biggest barriers that prevents people from wanting to know anything about Christ because all these other things are in the way. And so I put just a few thoughts together. I want us to kind of work through some things, and I'll recap this in a moment in our assessments and actions, but I want you to think about a few things. Most of us live here in the Hurricane Valley, so Tokerville, Laverkin, Hurricane, these areas. How are people suffering right here? What are you noticing as you walk around and you look at people? Maybe you're not walking around, so that's a place to start. Maybe you're not noticing people and trying to look for needs, and that's a place to start. What groups of people are being afflicted or oppressed or excluded by circumstances, by society? Maybe it's kids in poor families. Maybe it's the poor in general. Maybe it's people in nursing homes or care centers, care facilities. Maybe it's children and adults who have suffered from abuse. Maybe it's Native people groups or the Hispanic community that gets pushed to the edge. Maybe it's people with disabilities who are suffering and neglected. Maybe it's people who identify as LGBTQ+ or something of that nature that sets them apart and people just won't have anything to do with them because of their differences of perceptions. And all those people, to some degree or another, are suffering. And maybe you're one of those people in one of those categories, or maybe you're in a different category and you're suffering. We have people who are dealing with chronic illness or people that are dealing with life-threatening illness or things like that. So there's all kinds of areas. There are ways in which people are suffering, but what do you see in Hurricane Valley when you walk around, when you talk with neighbors, when you observe people? And then what can we do as a church to alleviate that suffering in our own little community here? And then beyond that, we can look at our world. How are people suffering currently in the world? And I guarantee you can make a list of those things right now. Is there anything that we can do in that regard? But also here, very much here on a local level. Because if we can do those things, people are really going to be drawn to Jesus in that sense flowing through us. And maybe that'll even open a better door for a message about Christ's kingdom and a desire for people to enter into it. Maybe. I think that's a lot for us to think about, and there's a lot of room that we have for growth in those areas. So here's how I summarized everything today. Here's some assessment questions and some actions we might take. One question, what barrier or barriers are preventing you from becoming a beacon of hope to your community? Jesus was that light who was thrown into the darkness after they dealt with so much. So is there anything that's getting in the way? Jesus had to get away from certain barriers. What is one way that you need to think and live differently in order to represent God's kingdom better? Jesus was calling people to repent, which means think differently. How can I become more available to partner with and learn from Jesus? That's like in our own time, because it's not just us doing the stuff that Jesus did, kind of. It's us actually being available enough to spend time with Jesus, who's already available for us, so we can learn from his example and he can teach us personally, not just through somebody's sermon on Sunday or a Bible study or a book we read. Fourth, take a walk around your neighborhood this week. If you don't do that, maybe that's something that we'll have to take up because I don't do that often. Look for an opportunity to have a conversation with at least one person. Just get out among people if you're not. And then lastly, who is suffering in our valley? How are those people suffering? And I would challenge you to make a list of ways that we as a church might be able to help alleviate various forms of affliction or oppression or exclusion that people are experiencing. And maybe those things will turn into a ministry. Maybe those things will even be something that God lays on your heart to begin and develop, and we can support you and assist you and bring people alongside of you in that so that we can better reach out to people and alleviate some of those basic things that get between people and Christ and his kingdom. All those are things I think just for us to take time for this week. God, I thank you for this message and for the challenging example that you set for us. There's a lot of things for us to reflect on and think about, but not just to think about, to take action on. And I pray that we would do that as we imitate you and we interact with people in our community the way that you interacted with people during your ministry. I pray that we'll see just the floodgates open and many people be changed by you. In Christ's name, amen.